but all of the attendant problems that come with societal decay. The opioid crisis is rampant. Hate groups, hate groups are a product of a decayed society. And I spent time with these groups, the Proud Boys, Knights of the Alt-Right, the Three Percenters, as well as Antifa and the Black Bloc, which I've been very critical of. And I think that kind of pornography of violence, that kind of violence as a form of catharsis is common to both the left and the right. The radical left, let's say.
I was saying to the organizers, there's really no way I could have declined this request to be here, because my very first job when I was 14 was working for the Toronto Public Library for $6.85 an hour. So we're very honored to have Chris Hedges here. I don't think he needs an introduction, because I'm also told by the organizer that when the tickets went up for 500 people, it sold out within 4 hours, so you probably know who he is, but in case you don't, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who was a foreign correspondent for 15 years for the New York Times, where he also served as the Middle East bureau chief for the paper. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. He writes a weekly column for the online magazine Truth Dig, and is the host of the Emmy award-winning RT America show On Contact. Hedges holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard University. He has taught at Princeton University, Columbia University, NYU, and the University of Toronto. He currently teaches courses in the New Jersey prison system. He's the author of a number of best-selling books, including his latest book, which is America: The Farewell Tour. Please welcome Chris. So, Chris, to many, the United States is a global power with a firm hold on the world. But in the book you say, short of a sudden and widespread popular revolt, the death spiral appears unstoppable, meaning the United States as we know it will no longer exist within a decade or at most two. That's quite a statement. What makes you say that?
Because it's pegged to the end of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That at that point, the empire becomes unsustainable, and the economy goes into free fall. We can see what happened in the 1950s when the pound sterling, after the debacle of the Suez Crisis, was dropped as the world's currency. We are following all the familiar trajectories of dying empires. We're just ticking everything off the list, including that final, what historians called micro-militarism, when you carry out, in this case, the 17 years of warfare in the Middle East, these feudal, self-destructive conflicts, which it's very difficult to extract yourself from. So yeah, on all levels, the America as we know it is terminal. When all of this will happen, and of course we're barreling towards another financial crisis, which even establishment organs like the New York Times, which had an editorial the other day on the removal of the Trump administration of the very tepid regulations imposed by Dodd-Frank. I mean, even that we read Paul Krugman, and I read Paul Krugman, I still read the Times every day, and there are columns that he sounds like me. I mean, people are very worried, and then we haven't even dealt with the issue of climate change.
The Dodd-Frank regulations that went into place post the financial crisis, the implementation of that has been slow, to say the least. How does that factor into your prediction that?
Well, we mishandled the 2008 global financial collapse.
How so?
we bailed out the banks to, I mean, anywhere between $4 to $7 trillion. We manufactured money, what Marx calls fictitious capital. We not only lent that money at virtually 0% interest, and there were central banks in Europe that were, it was actually negative. They would pay you to take money. And we re-inflated the speculative economy. None of this money went towards infrastructure. I mean, China's reaction after 2008 was the opposite. None of it went to infrastructure projects. None of it bailed out the pension funds, the municipal funds, all of which dropped sometimes by 40%, not to mention all those people had IRAs. So the victims were left with nothing. The victimizers were bailed out. And that mechanism of re-inflating the market through 0% interest means that there's no plan B, that the next time around, they don't know what they're going to do. And then we have watched this massive tax cut, which over the next 10 years will bleed an estimated $1.5 trillion out of revenue from the US budget. And what have they done with the money? They bought back their own stock to inflate the value of the stock, which is why you have an overheated stock market, because that feeds the compensation. The compensation packages of CEOs and senior management is tied to the value of the stock. So it all looks pretty grim financially. And Dodd-Frank, we just saw the other day that they essentially removed controls for most banks. This was a very recent development, which has left most of the financial market now completely unregulated. So it's extremely dangerous. And when we get hit this time, I don't know how they're going to be able to respond in a kind of, I don't know how they're going to be able to reinflate the market. So, I mean, they can try and turn around and manufacture money again, but then you're flirting with hyperinflation.
So in your estimation, what would a world post-United States as a superpower look like then?
Probably a multipolar world.
Explain.
So you have certain spheres of influence, China, for instance. Maybe in the Middle East, Turkey. Turkey would like to play that role. That's why they're messing around in Syria.
I'm surprised to hear you say Turkey.
Well, in the Middle East. I mean, Erdogan clearly has visions of recreating the Ottoman reach. Whether he can or not, I don't know. And if Turkey, of course, has got its own financial crisis at the moment. But yeah, I suspect a kind of multipolar world. There are some questions, and that is what will be the power of international finance, which has been able to essentially seize control of economies quite effectively. You see it in India, for instance, countries like India, Pakistan, where people don't have control because of the IMF and the World Bank and Goldman Sachs. I mean, Greece is the kind of most egregious example of this. These states can't control their own economies, and so they revert to this politics of national identity, that economic decline is interpreted. Reagan and Thatcher kind of started this, is an assault against our national identity, against our values, and that's where you get the Islamophobia, the anti-immigrant stance, the rise of these right-wing proto-fascists in countries like Hungary or the United States. It's built out of that economic paralysis and political paralysis, because anytime a cabal seizes power, whether it's monarchical, communist, fascist, or in our case, corporate, the system seizes up. It no longer is able to implement what is fundamental to a democracy, as Karl Popper points out, and that's incremental or piecemeal reform. You can't staunch the assault, whether it's through austerity, stagnant wages, or in essence declining wages, and we go back to that, the borrowing at 0% interest. The money has to be repaid. And so the international financiers impose punishing forms of debt peonage on the population in order to pay back the money. And so that's where you get this, in the United States, this student loan crisis of $1.4 trillion. And even if you declare bankruptcy, you're still responsible for, it's a really pernicious system.
Because you can't actually, even personal bankruptcy, it might be the same in Canada, actually, where student loans don't count against your bankruptcy.
We do everything you shouldn't do, and then 10 years later you copy us. I have never figured that out. Our healthcare system, so costs, we have the most expensive healthcare system and the least efficient in the industrialized world, but we're spending, I think, 18% of GDP. It's staggering the amount of money. So even if you have insurance, 1 million people a year in the United States go bankrupt because they can't pay health insurance, pay health costs, and they have insurance. Credit cards are another one. So as soon as you're late on your credit card, you're suddenly paying 28% interest. So there's all these mechanisms by which they gouge the citizenry, all these hidden costs, all the private. I opened the book in Scranton, as you know, where the city is just selling off municipal assets, the sewer system, the utilities, to get money because they're trying to stave off insolvency or bankruptcy. And that's a short term. What happens when they don't have any assets to sell? And then once they've sold the assets, rates, including the parking authority, double, triple. And I think the per capita income in Scranton is $45,000 a year or something. So, there are no mechanisms left. There are no impediments, either internal or external, to halt this pillage. So we're headed for a crisis, political, economic crisis of immense magnitude, of which Trump is the symptom of the decayed system. He's not the disease.
I take it from parts of the book where you mention some dates that this book began before the election.
It did. It began, began 2 years ago, and I actually had the title, America, the Farewell Tour, and all of the editors at Simon & Schuster thought I was once again being very hyperbolic. And then Trump got elected, so I wrote my chapter, as you know, on the gambling, because I write about...
So did the election change at all what was ultimately in the book? Or
No, because the election confirmed everything that was in the book. Because the book was about the pathologies of a diseased culture. And, how in a decayed or a diseased culture, these perverted forms of behavior express themselves, which are hardly unique to the United States. When I studied classics, I know what the late Roman Empire looked like, which is a lot like the United States. And Trump, when I wrote my chapter on gambling, so I write about what sociologists call diseases of despair. So that's heroin, drug addiction, gambling, suicide, sexual sadism.
But didn't those things always exist in the States?
Yes, but I think most people have no idea how pervasive, just the opioid crisis alone is. Gambling, the figures are in the book, but it's kind of staggering. Which, by the way, gamblers have the highest rate of suicide of any addict. And the way the gambling industry has proliferated, because with the fall of revenue for states because of a decline in taxation, everybody's building casinos right and left as a form of economic development. And I'd cover the war in the former Yugoslavia, and I'd watch the Yugoslavs try that, and it didn't work out real well. So Trump, when I write the gambling chapter, I wrote it out of the Trump Taj Mahal before he even announced. I just thought he was this bizarre, corrupt con artist who kind of would be good for the book. And by the time I finished, he was president.
You also write that under every measurement, from the financial growth and infrastructure investment to advanced technology, including supercomputers, space weaponry, and cyber warfare, we are being rapidly overtaken by the Chinese. Is there anything you think that's unique to America, that America does well, that the Chinese would not be able to overtake America in?
Yeah, weapons. We make the best weapons in the world, and we are the largest arms exporter in the world, and we are hollowing ourselves out from the inside by funding this unaudited, uncontrollable, phenomenally bloated military budget, just like the late Roman Empire, which had 1 million members of the Roman legion, it was trying to sustain. So, you know, we're rapidly kind of becoming like a third world country with nukes. Because the disparity, I mean, you know it from having been in Pakistan, but you see it in the developing world, and I certainly saw it when I lived in Latin America, for example, where when I lived in Lima, I lived in a section of Lima called Miraflores that kind of looked like Miami, except for the walls were a little higher and they had concertina wire on them. But you could walk 10 blocks and go to the Pueblos Jóvenes, where people were living in open sewers without electricity or running. And that's what America's becoming, these pockets of immense wealth, concentrated wealth. And because I traveled all over the country for this book, I saw it. I mean, the whole cities just wrecked, decayed wastelands. Cleveland, Detroit, I was in Anderson, where GM used to have plants, then Clinton passes NAFTA. By 2006, all those plants have literally been bulldozed. They're just big, gigantic, open, weed-filled lots. They've moved to Monterrey, Mexico. They're paying Mexican workers $3 an hour with no benefits, no job security, no pensions, nothing. All of these union UAW jobs, all these UAW jobs are gone. People who made $25, $30 an hour could sustain a family on a single income, own their own house, had a pension, had medical benefits, sent their kids, that's vanished across America. And Anderson looks like every other deindustrialized pocket of the United States, not only with everything shutting down, churches for sale, all that kind of stuff, but all of the attendant problems that come with societal decay. You know, the opioid crisis is rampant. Hate groups, I mean, hate groups are a product of a decayed society. And I spent time with these groups, the Proud Boys, Knights of the Alt-Right, the Three Percenters, as well as Antifa and the Black Bloc, which I've been very critical of. And I think that kind of pornography of violence, that kind of violence as a form of catharsis is common to both the left and the right, the radical left, let's say.
And you don't, as you said, you've been critical of Antifa, which is a left-wing extremist movement that violently opposes groups that it considers fascist, including Democratic and center-right. And you don't think that movement can lead to real change?
No, I think it's a gift to the security and surveillance. First of all, I think half of them are cops. But
you think what?
Half of them are cops. I mean, you read any counterinsurgency, man, read Lenin. I mean, even though his own brother was involved in the assassination of Alexander II and hanged, Lenin recognized that anarchist violence was very detrimental to the revolution. Why? Because any revolution, and that's really what I'm calling for. I'm calling for the overthrow of corporate power. And I don't believe that that's going to come through the calcified mechanisms and institutions that once made reform and democracy possible, including, of course, the Congress and the courts, which have stripped us of our constitutional rights by judicial fiat, in essence. It needs broad-based popular support. And the theorists of revolution, Crane Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and others, have all argued, I think correctly, that no revolution succeeds unless a significant percentage of the internal mechanism of control defects. So, for instance, in the Russian Revolution, the pivotal point was when there were bread riots in Petrograd. They sent in the Cossacks and they wouldn't crush the rioters. In fact, they joined them. The Tsar is up directing the troops. They rush him back, and he has to abdicate before he even gets back to the city in a railway carriage. You saw the same I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, so you saw the same thing in East Germany, where Erich Honecker, who had been the communist dictator for 19 years, sends an elite paratroop division to Leipzig, where these protests, the epicenter of these protests, and when the paratroopers get there, the local Communist Party officials refuse to deploy them in the streets. Honecker's out within a week. As soon as the Shah flees and the head of the armed forces in Iran announces that the military will no longer, the Iranian military, which I think was the fourth largest in the world. I mean, the Shah wasted a lot of money on American weaponry. And they said when they would no longer defend the regime, they would not defend the regime, it was finished. So what the counter-revolutionary forces seek to do is demonize the movement and make people fearful of it. And the Black Bloc and Antifa provide that to them. I've dealt with them. I dealt with them a lot at Occupy, and they protest me, especially on the West Coast, where I'm about to go. So, I mean, to the point where they will call in threats. I spoke in LA, and I arrived, and they'd hired these 3 bodyguards because of it. But outside the hall, they'll walk up and down, dressed in black, with their face, with signs that say "F you, Chris Hedges." Every sign saying the same thing.
They did speak to you for your book, though. Members did speak to you for your book.
Yeah, not much.
Okay.
And a lot of those interviews were done by my research assistant. Yeah.
Okay.
They don't like me too much. But I think they're I just think they're immature. I think they're juvenile. I think that it is about them being able to carry out property destruction. Primarily, it's property destruction. But we're never gonna confront this system of corporate totalitarianism through property destruction or violence. And I was overseas. I mean, I've seen the U.S. military at work, including we have 60,000 members of the special forces alone, which are called death squads. We just can't match them at that. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were surrounded by the Serbs, literally with a kind of trench system for 3.5 years. It was like World War I, the Somme, and every once in a while some Muslim commander would get this bright idea that they were going to retake a few hundred yards of land, and there'd be starbursts up in the middle of the night, and you'd hear the rattle of machine guns, and the next day, 200 Muslim kids were dead, scrambling through, a blasted section of ground that was meaningless. We knew that if the Serbs broke through those trenches, 1/3 of the city would be slaughtered, and the rest would be driven into refugee and displacement camps, not to mention the torture, rape, which was endemic by the Serbs. So nobody sat around. We were being hit with 2,000 shells a day. Nobody sat around in those basements arguing about pacifism, but it didn't save them from the poison of violence. So there are moments when people seek your annihilation actively, as was the case in Sarajevo, or in the case of Iraq or Afghanistan, or Gaza, where you have a foreign occupation, where that foreign occupier speaks exclusively in the language of force. So I used to work in Algeria, and when I would get to the airport, I would say, "Welcome to Algeria, land of 1,000,000 martyrs." They were able to bleed like the North Vietnamese in a way that the French were not. But that's not the situation we're in. Revolutions are different entities, and that's what we're trying to pull off. And so it means that we have to be strategic and disciplined. We have to speak with the moral force that this corrupt system can no longer employ. One of the reasons that you have seen the further isolation of critics of imperialism, and in particular the ideology of neoliberalism. And David Harvey, if anybody really wants to read a good book on neoliberalism, get David Harvey's book. He kind of lays it out. I mean, like Marx, he understood that this was just an utterly utopian. John Ralston Saul's Voltaire's Bastards also, or he wrote a book later, The Collapse of Globalism. But it was just an ideology to justify greed. It was utterly utopian. It never made sense. And so we now have a situation, certainly within the United States, and I would argue probably most of Europe, where people aren't buying that ideology anymore. It doesn't matter where they come from in the political spectrum. This is what saw the insurgency of Sanders and the insurgency of Trump. And so what you've seen is critics of capitalism and imperialism, such as myself, have already been pushed to the margins of the internet, locked out of public broadcasting even. Chomsky, all of us. And, but what they're doing now is using Google algorithms to further cut us off from the public. So for instance, I write for Robert Scheer's great website, TruthDig. I don't know if you know Bob Scheer, former editor of Ramparts, one of the great icons of American journalism. And Google and Facebook and Twitter, in the name of fake news, of course. And we had this shadowy group called Prop or Not, Propaganda or Not, enlisting all the major left-wing sites, Counterpunch, antiwar.com, Alternet, World Socialist website, my site, TruthDig, as being purveyors of fake news on the part of the Kremlin. And the Washington Post played it up. And so anyway, that gave the excuse for these algorithms. And what they do is they have something called impressions, where if you went into Google and typed imperialism, and I had written before the impressions were cut an article on imperialism, it would come up with other articles. Now, those algorithms lock me out. So we've seen a graph in the last 12 months in TruthDig with over 700,000 referrals from impressions dropping to over 200,000. All of the left-wing sites have been decimated. Alternet's lost 63%, Counterpunch, Black Agenda Report, and that coupled with the abolition of net neutrality are an effective weapon. And I think that's because the ideology has lost credibility and is bankrupt, these marginalized critics suddenly become much more dangerous. And again, you go back to all of the indicators of a system that is in the death throes, and that loss of credibility is key. And so coupled with it has seen, certainly within the United States, horrific forms of state violence, state intrusion, militarized police. 3.3 Americans, almost all unarmed, are shot and killed every day in the streets of American cities. Mass incarceration. We have created in marginal communities, as you know, I would call them, militarized zones of terror. That's not too strong a word. I mean, if you're a mother with a young African-American son and it's dark, you don't know if they're ever coming home, and it's because of the cops.
But aren't the grievances that the groups like Antifa have, aren't they valid?
Well, I share some of them on the left, of course. But, I mean, this could be a whole evening on anarchism. I mean, the anarchists support pornography, which I don't. They support prostitution, which I don't. They believe, and I think this particularly affects the vulnerable and in particularly protects women, that, for instance, if you're raped, you shouldn't go to the police because you're a snitch. I'm not opposed to policing when it's carried out for public safety. I am opposed to policing when it's carried out to shoot people and oppress people of color.
So what police force in the world would you say is getting it right?
I would say police should not carry weapons. It's a better way to say it.
And there are police forces in the world that don't.
Well, I mean, I mean, the old Bobby didn't carry a weapon. But I mean, this gets into the whole, what was the British police force? Well, it was based on Peel's formation of a home guard in Ireland to stop and then exported to Britain to break. And I mean, police forces were created in the Peel model to suppress radicals. I mean, that's what they did in Ireland, and that's what they did in Britain. And so, but you create the veneer of creating a police force around criminality, which it almost never is. And the United States followed that Peel model because we had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. I mean, hundreds of American workers were murdered by gun thugs, Pinkertons, Baldwin Felts, company goons, and local police forces, because they were local, identified with the workers, so they had to create state police forces and private militias. That's, the Pennsylvania State Police, which were brutal especially in the old coal fields and stuff in Pennsylvania. They used to call them the Pennsylvania Cossacks. So that gets into a whole other issue of why do we have police? Well, it's not why we're told we have police. But nevertheless, having lived in the former Yugoslavia, where all hierarchical systems of authority had been destroyed, or having worked in places like the Congo, where it was, whoever had the biggest trunk load of AK-47s took over, I have a healthy respect for order. The problem is who manages that order and what is their intent.
So I want to go back to corporate America, which, as we know, you're very critical of. But having lived in the US, one thing I would say, and even here, one thing I'm struck by is the level of innovation that comes out of America. And you could say, and people do say, that partly it's to do with the fact that money is a huge motivator. When there is, the potential to make millions of dollars, people do invent things that do end up doing good for society. One example I can think of is I am a mother of a child with special needs. What the machinery that helps her eat, that helps her walk, all invented in the United States. So is there a concern that if we take money as a motivator away from people, that it affects innovation, that ultimately helps people as well?
No, I mean, the problem is that, those particular, let's talk about Silicon Valley. So those innovators themselves make a lot of money. But what they do is all of that technology is built in sweatshops in China or Bangladesh, where workers live under Dickinsonian conditions that replicate the hell of industrial England in the late 19th century. And we know from China, I mean, you have whole cities that are making, Apple, everybody's out there, of 100,000 people, but they're secret. I mean, the security apparatus is such that you can't get in there, you can't film it. They live in these horrific dormitories. There's constant wage theft, and so if they don't meet their production quotas, they're not paid.
All that totally true. I mean, I don't think there's.
So it's not. It's these people who are innovators should not be given a free pass to be predators. That's the point. That's the problem.
You also write in your book, when a government watches you 24 hours a day, you cannot use the word liberty. This is the relationship between a master and a slave. In your view, are there any successful ways that citizens can resist this constant surveillance? Because I know, if you're worried about the NSA listening to your call, you still have to get through your day and make your calls. So the tendency is to say, okay, well, they're watching me anyways. There's nothing I can do.
Well, it's worse than that. I mean, Facebook, I don't know why anyone's on Facebook. I'm not. I mean, we have handed all of our information. It's called the box industry. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So they have everything on us. Our health records, our employment records, and the danger of that, as Hannah Arendt points out in Origins of Totalitarianism, is that when a government has wholesale surveillance of an entire population, it's not because they're looking for crime. It's because they have information, and we saw that especially under Stalinism, where they pull up your file and they will find something for which they will criminalize you for. And you can be sure that in a moment of societal breakdown, our corporate masters will use it. Now, and also remember that in the United States, 70% of all government intelligence is contracted out to corporations like Bose Allen Hamilton. And you can be sure they're not just spying on us for the US government.
But what do you see as a solution? Not be on Facebook?
Well, there are other issues with Facebook. You can read Empire of Illusion about that. I mean, Facebook is about that whole, me, the life movie. It's about presentation. It's not about truth. And it kind of sucks you into this black hole of narcissism and trivia, and it's a giant waste of time. And it hands to the owners of Facebook all of your personal data, all of your friends' personal data that they sell. That's the business model. This kind of thing about people being surprised at Cambridge Analytica. No, that's their business model. That's why they have Facebook. That's why their stock is worth so much. Well, it's declined, but so it's very hard to escape from the electronic tentacles. But when I'll give an example. So I was in Zuccotti Park during the Occupy movement quite a bit. And after the mayor, Bloomberg, attempted to seize the park and failed, it was clear to the activists that they would come again. But this time they would come without any warning, probably as they did in the middle of the night. And so the Direct Action Committee wanted to prepare some kind of surprise for the NYPD. So they all came down to my house in Princeton, slept all over my floor, and everybody sat at the dining room table. All electronic devices this was before Snowden, so they were very prescient. All electronic devices were put in the car, phones, computers, everything in the car in the driveway. Nobody spoke, everybody wrote on pieces of paper and handed them back and forth, and then we burned them in the fireplace. And when the NYPD came, they stormed the park, and it was pretty brutal. And they got to the kitchen area in the center of the park, and they found 20 activists chained to the kitchen, and they didn't have chain cutters. And that was it was like, you don't know everything. It was Pyrrhic, and yet kind of cool. So I think we have to be aware of how, and I think one of the things that's was so disturbing after Barack Obama, in a nationally coordinated effort, shut down all Occupy encampments in America, was that because these people had communicated through electronic devices, they knew who the key figures were. And in the months following, I can speak, I'm sure it was national, but I know from New York, there were, and it didn't get much reporting, but they were bursting into lofts where people were squatting and stealing all their computer equipment. They were taking, it's not a surprise, they got the right people. They were taking them and fabricating felony convictions against them and forcing them to plea out. So for instance, one activist was charged with holding a pair of scissors and carrying out what was called an attempted assault, a deadly assault against a police officer. Now they filmed Zuccotti 24 hours a day, but of course they didn't film that assault because it didn't exist. And it was his word against the cops. And he had to plea out on a 5-year felony conviction, which means that if they pick him up for anything else, he goes to prison for 7 years. And that was a very effective technique to neuter the best activists. It's very dark what's happening. It's subterranean because all of the resistance is subterranean. If you watch the 24-hour burlesque show on CNN, you won't see it. You'll see a porn star and her lawyer, who now wants to run for president, and Omarosa, who has about as much credibility as Donald Trump. And they love it. They make money on it. It's entertainment, has zero to do with news. Meanwhile, these very serious movements are taking place within the country. And I would also add very profound suffering by at least half the population or more. And they're rendered utterly invisible. And I think that's why the credibility, and I think rightly so, of the press, and most people when they speak of the press now speak of the electronic media, the commercial electronic media, is so low. I don't know what it is, 9%, or, I mean, it's really, I think it might be below 10%. Because the pain and the dislocation and the injustices that have been carried out are ignored by the elite. And they've all become like courtiers in, Louis XIV in Versailles, commenting on which mistress he took into the bedchamber. While the real world, what's happening outside their version of the Forbidden City, is completely unreported and more dangerously unknown. So when the Republican establishment wants to destroy Trump during the primaries, remember who they trotted out to destroy him? The big gun? Mitt Romney. Wow.
So
Trump's finished there,
You talk about the need to create alliances and listen to people unlike ourselves, and you are critical of people who write off Trump supporters. You say in the book, the left often dismisses Trump supporters as irredeemable racists and bigots, ignoring their betrayal and suffering. Yet, in the same chapter, you also called President Trump an imbecile and a narcissist. Do you see any contradictions in that message?
No, because Trump has power. They don't. I went to divinity school, and that whole issue of forgiveness. And although I did have a great theology professor who once told me, only God forgives.
But if the goal is to create alliances with people, and he has people who are...
Right, but we're talking about power. When people are carrying out, let's call it for what it is, Kant called it radical evil. When people are empowered to the extent that they are destroying and crushing human lives, ripping children from their mother's arms, and then putting these children in warehouses where they are drugged and abused, when they are carrying out militarized drone attacks, terrorizing citizens across the Middle East, including, of course, in Pakistan, when they are unleashing militarized police to gun down citizens in the street, when they are forcing families whose sons or daughters are ill into bankruptcy to save their children, then we have every right to call them out for who they are. And I look at the Trump supporters ultimately as victims. I don't defend their racism, their Islamophobia, their homophobia, all of that, of course, their misogyny, but they're victims. And I learned that lesson when I wrote my book on the Christian right. Because
victims of what?
They're victims of a system that has cast them aside, crushed their dreams and their hopes, told them that they are worthless and have nothing to contribute. They have reacted the way victims often react in a society, by demonizing the vulnerable. Let's not, just be clear, you have systems of indoctrination that spew this garbage out over the airwaves. And critics of the power elites, such as myself, have been effectively shut out. So they're being bombarded by Fox News. I mean, talk about fake news. This whole debate on the Russiagate, I'm thinking, no, if you want to go after the foreign government that has most interfered in American elections, that's Israel. If you want to go after fake news, we've got it on cable channels and on the radio. Sean Hannity, I mean, he's not sane, I mean, this guy. And they have huge corporate sponsors. They make tons of money. So you have a powerful system of indoctrination coupled with people who have bought this, as we spoke about earlier, this belief that what's happened to them is an assault against their national identity. It's been taken away from them by Muslims, I mean, it's of course absurd, undocumented workers, women, African American, the list. And in degenerate societies, this is what I saw in Yugoslavia, we can watch it in India. I mean, how far is Modi from this? That's what happens. The power elites seek to divert this legitimate rage towards the weak. And so these people have been betrayed. The way that they're reacting is indefensible and ultimately self-destructive. But that is what happens in diseased and decayed society. I mean, I was in Montgomery, Alabama with a great civil rights attorney, Brian Stevenson, and we were walking through the city. And Brian was showing me all the Confederate monuments in the city. And then he said, most of these have been put up in the last 10 years. And I said, that is exactly what happened with the breakdown of Yugoslavia. All these Yugoslavs suddenly became Serb nationalists or Croat nationalists. I remember I was with the 5th Corps after the NATO bombing. We were moving with Dudakovich's 5th Corps on Banja Luka, and I was on the front lines, and I was with a battalion of quote-unquote shaheeds, so they all had green headbands. First of all these Muslims in Bosnia could drink, you, me, and anyone else in this room under the table. They hadn't ever been in a mosque. I mean, it was kind of like the Christian right. They knew a few kind of catchwords and cliches. So I'm with this battalion of, who are being demonized, of course, by the West. And they find out that I'd spent 7 years in the Middle East and I spoke Arabic. And then they all wanted to know if I'd read the Quran. And I was the only one of 900 people who actually read the Quran. Yeah.
So I'm told we're going to take some questions, but I did want to give you a chance to answer one criticism people have of your work, which is that your message is too bleak. It's too hopeless.
Well, my answer is,
what do you say to those people?
I didn't make it up. I mean, I read climate change reports, and it's pretty bleak and pretty frightening, and we don't have much time left, and we better realize how bleak it is, and we better rise up and get rid of these people, or they are going to extinguish the human race.